Nobody expected a simple classroom debate to turn into a moment that would leave an entire school speechless. It started like any other day. Barron Trump, now a college freshman, walked into his political science class just like everyone else. He never asked for special treatment, never drew attention to himself. But no matter how much he tried to blend in, people noticed him. Some students whispered when he walked by, others stared. And his professor? Professor Mark Ellison, a well-known liberal academic, had made it very clear from day one that he had strong opinions about the Trump family. At first, Barron ignored it. The occasional sarcastic comment, the subtle jabs about his father's presidency, it was nothing new. But that day was different. The topic of discussion was leadership and democracy. Professor Ellison paced in front of the whiteboard, marker in hand, exuding authority and confidence. Leadership, he said, isn't just about power. It's about earning the respect of the people you lead. And history has shown us that some so-called leaders gain power not through respect, but through fear, manipulation, and misinformation. A few students nodded in agreement. Barron knew where this was going. Professor Ellison smirked, turning toward Barron's side of the room. Let's take an example, he said. Donald Trump. A few students chuckled. Barron remained still. Professor Ellison continued, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Now, some people think Trump was a great leader, but let's be honest. Was he really? He turned to the class, gesturing dramatically. Or was he simply a man who used fear, division, and propaganda to maintain control? The room was silent. The professor let the question linger. Then he smiled, turning his gaze directly to Barron. You probably have some thoughts on this, don't you? He asked, mocking politeness. A few students shifted in their seats, sensing the tension. Barron met the professor's gaze. He had two choices. He could stay quiet, let the moment pass, let everyone believe that he had nothing to say, or he could remind them exactly who he was. Barron leaned forward, resting his forearms on his desk. His voice was calm, measured, dangerous. I do have thoughts, he said. But first, let me ask you something, Professor. The room tensed. Professor Ellison raised an eyebrow. Go ahead. Barron's blue eyes locked onto him. If Donald Trump was such a terrible leader, Barron asked, then why did he accomplish more for the American people than most politicians do in a lifetime? A few murmurs rippled through the classroom. Professor Ellison's smile tightened. Barron continued. Let's talk about unemployment, he said. Before COVID, my father brought record-low unemployment, especially for minority communities. He rebuilt the economy, cut taxes, and secured trade deals that actually benefited American workers. He leaned back slightly. That's what real leadership looks like. Professor Ellison sighed dramatically, shaking his head. Oh, Barron, he said. It's adorable that you believe all of that. Some students laughed. Barron didn't even blink. That's an interesting response, he said smoothly. When faced with facts, instead of arguing against them, you choose to mock me. The laughter stopped. Barron tilted his head. I thought real intellectuals debated ideas. I didn't realize your strategy was just sarcasm, a few students whispered, smirking. Professor Ellison's face twitched. Barron wasn't done. You talk about leadership, he said, and yet here you are, a professor, an authority figure, trying to humiliate a student in front of an entire class. Is that what good leadership looks like? The room was completely still. Professor Ellison crossed his arms. Leadership is about more than just numbers, Barron. It's about ethics. Your father? He spread misinformation. He attacked the press. Barron cut him off. You mean he called out the media for lying? Barron said. Because last time I checked, CNN settled a multi-million-dollar lawsuit for smearing a conservative student. A wave of murmurs went through the room. Professor Ellison's jaw tightened. Barron leaned forward again. I find it interesting, he said, that when liberal politicians criticize the media, they're exposing corruption. But when my father did it, he was attacking democracy. Silence. Barron smiled slightly. Seems like a double standard to me. A student from the back of the class suddenly clapped once, then another, then another. Within seconds, half the room was applauding. Professor Ellison's face was red. The students weren't laughing at Barron anymore. They were looking at him differently, as if, for the first time, they were actually listening. And he knew it. The professor cleared his throat. "Well," he said stiffly, "I think we've spent enough time on this discussion. Let's move on." Barron leaned back, relaxed. "Sure," he said. "Let's move on." But as the professor turned back toward the whiteboard, Barron could tell this wasn't over. The silence in the classroom wasn't normal. Professor Mark Ellison had tried to shut down the debate, to steer the conversation away from what had just happened. But it was too late. He had lost control of the room, and everyone knew it. Barron Trump sat back in his chair, his face calm, unreadable, but his presence undeniable. He had turned the tables in less than 5 minutes, not by shouting, not by getting emotional, but by simply doing what nobody expected. He had stood his ground. Ellison picked up his marker and turned to the whiteboard, trying to regain control. "All right," he said, clearing his throat. "Let's move on. We've discussed leadership and its pitfalls enough for today." But nobody was paying attention anymore. Across the room, students were still looking at Barron, some whispering, others just sitting there, thinking. And then, a voice cut through the silence. "Professor, can I ask something?" It was a young woman in the second row, her glasses reflecting the bright classroom lights. She wasn't one of the usual talkers, which made her question all the more surprising. Ellison forced a polite smile. "If it's relevant to the topic," she didn't back down. "It is," she said, glancing toward Barron. Barron made a strong argument. "Why did you dismiss it instead of engaging with it?" The tension in the room thickened. Ellison's grip tightened around the marker, his jaw clenching ever so slightly. "I didn't dismiss it," he said, his voice measured. "I simply pointed out that facts are different from perspectives, and Barron's views, while well-spoken, are clearly influenced by personal bias." A few students scoffed. Barron smirked. "Personal bias?" he repeated, raising an eyebrow. "That's interesting, considering everything you've said today is based on your personal opinions about my father." A few chuckles spread through the room. Ellison ignored them. "I teach based on history and political analysis," the professor said, his voice slightly sharper now. "Not partisan loyalty." Barron leaned forward. "You call it analysis, but it sounds a lot like cherry-picking to me," he said. "You mention leadership, but only when it fits a certain narrative. You talk about democracy, but only when it suits your argument. You claim you're unbiased, yet you refuse to acknowledge any of the successes of my father's administration." The classroom stirred again. Ellison exhaled sharply through his nose, his patience visibly thinning. "That's because leadership isn't just about successes, Barron," he snapped. "It's about the morality behind those successes. And I refuse to stand here and pretend that your father's presidency wasn't built on divisiveness, fear-mongering, and corruption." The words hung in the air, thick, heavy. Barron's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the room. For the first time, Ellison had slipped up. He had stopped acting like an educator and started acting like a man with a grudge, and the students noticed. A voice from the back cut through the tension. "That's funny," said a tall, broad-shouldered student near the window, "because I remember my dad saying he got his best job in years under Trump's tax cuts. That was the first time we actually had savings." Another student, a young black man in a hoodie, leaned forward. "My uncle got off welfare after the economy started booming," he added. "He actually started his own business." More murmurs rippled through the room. Ellison looked around, his authority crumbling. "That's—" he started, but a new voice cut in. "Professor," said a quiet girl with short blonde hair, her tone thoughtful, "you always tell us to question everything, but right now, it feels like you're just trying to shut down one side of the argument." The tension spiked. Barron remained completely still, but his presence in the conversation was everywhere. Ellison tried to laugh it off, but it sounded forced. "I'm not shutting anything down," he said. "I just don't think this classroom should become a debate stage for opinions you don't like," Barron interjected smoothly. Another round of chuckles and murmurs. Ellison's face tightened. The students were no longer passively listening. They were thinking, questioning, challenging. And for a professor who had built his reputation on controlling the conversation, that was the worst possible outcome. I think that's enough of this discussion, Ellison said, his tone clipped now. Let's move on. But the energy in the room had already shifted. Barron had exposed something that couldn't be unseen. The authority of the professor wasn't absolute anymore. Class ended sooner than usual. As students gathered their things, Barron could hear whispers all around him. That was insane. I never saw a professor get shut down like that. I didn't even like Trump, but Barron made sense. As Barron stood to leave, the girl from earlier, the one who had first challenged the professor, approached him. That was impressive, she admitted. I didn't expect you to, actually be that well-spoken. Barron smirked. Yeah, I get that a lot. She laughed. Well, I'm actually curious now. If you ever want to talk more about this, let me know. She handed him a piece of paper. Barron took it, reading the number. He smiled. I might just do that. As he walked out of the classroom, he could feel all the eyes on him. And for the first time since stepping into that school, he wasn't just Donald Trump's son, he was Barron Trump. And everyone knew it. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that inspire and challenge us to grow. What would you have done if you were in his shoes? Let us know in the comments below.